Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the most miserable childhoods you can imagine. You're small, barely old enough to know your alphabet, yet every morning you're forced into a blackened brick tunnel that could suffocate you before you ever see daylight again. And the worst part, that wasn't the most dangerous thing about being a chimney sweeper. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy these dives into the nastier corners of history. And tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe put on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in Victorian London. The good news, you're alive. The bad news, you're a chimney sweep, which means you're about to spend your morning wedged inside a sooty brick coffin that just happens to be vertical, your bed. A pile of rags in a cramped attic that smells like damp straw and human breath. The blanket has never been washed, unless you count rain leaking through the roof. Every surface is dusted with a fine black powder that never leaves, no matter how many times you shake it out. Even your skin feels like sandpaper from sleeping on soot night after night. You're not much older than 6 or 7, and already you're considered prime chimney size. Employers didn't look for strength, they looked for how small you were. Too tall, too heavy, or too healthy, and you weren't useful. But small, malnourished and desperate, perfect. Into the flue you go. And here's the fun part. Chimneys weren't built with you in mind. Some were as narrow as 9 inches across. 9 inches. Imagine squeezing your shoulders, knees and skull through a space barely wider than a modern dinner plate. If you get stuck, tough luck. If you panic and can't move, you might suffocate before anyone bothers to pull you out. The air tastes like burnt tar and mouldy coal dust. Your eyes sting, your throat closes, and the only sound you hear is your own cough echoing up the shaft. Some chimneys were still warm, the embers faintly glowing at the bottom, which meant your arms blistered as you scraped and kicked your way upward. Every climb was a gamble between choking, burning, or just passing out halfway up. And while you're struggling, the people outside aren't horrified, they're relieved. To them, you're not a child, you're a tool. Their cosy fires depended on you, because without constant cleaning, soot would pile up and ignite. Entire homes could burn down. So Victorian society turned a blind eye, comforted by the idea that children's lives were cheaper than property insurance. The reward for all this? Maybe a crust of bread, maybe a few pennies, and eventually something even better. Soot-wort. That was the charming name for chimney sweep's carcinoma, the first industrial cancer ever recorded. It grew in the most humiliating of places, and by the time you noticed, it usually meant amputation or death. A medical bonus prize for a life spent inside blackened brick tunnels. When you weren't working, you weren't resting. Sweeps often slept in basements or sheds on bags of collected soot, because beds cost money and soot bags were free. Your skin stayed permanently grey, your nails cracked, and your lungs rattled like loose floorboards. Some Victorians joked that sweeps were born black, which was their way of laughing at the fact you would never be clean again. And yet, bizarrely, sweeps became symbols of luck. Brides wanted to shake your hand on their wedding day, believing your misery could be rubbed off onto their marriage for good fortune. Nothing says happily ever after like holding hands with someone who just crawled out of a chimney shaft. The soot, the heat, the suffocation. All of it presses in as you try to climb. Your knees scrape raw, your chest tightens, and for a moment you wonder if the darkness above is ever going to end. But don't worry, it does. And then you get to do it all again tomorrow. And if you think that sounds unbearable, wait until you hear what sweeps were fed to keep them climbing. Because Victorian diets had their own way of making sure life never tasted clean. You crawl out of the chimney, coughing up soot that clings to your teeth like tar. Your eyes burn, your arms are streaked with cuts, and your lungs feel like they have been lined with sandpaper. The climb is over for now, but another misery waits. Your reward for risking suffocation and burns is not rest, it is food. And Victorian chimney sweep food deserves its own lecture in human cruelty. Meals were not about nourishment, they were about keeping you just alive enough to keep climbing. Bread was the staple, if you can call it that. Not the softer loaves you buy at a bakery today, but heavy, stale chunks that could chip a tooth. Sweeps were often given bread so dry it had to be soaked in water before eating, and water was not the safe filtered kind either. London water supplies in the 1800s were practically open sewers. By the 1850s, the Thames had become so polluted with human waste and industrial runoff that newspapers called it the Great Stink. Yet it was still piped into homes and workplaces, so when you washed down that crust of bread with a gulp, you were taking in cholera, dysentery, and whatever had floated downstream that week. If you were lucky, the bread came with dripping, which is exactly what it sounds like. Fat that dripped off roasted meat in wealthy households was saved, congealed, and sold cheap to the poor. It was greasy, grey, and often rancid by the time it reached you, but fat meant calories and calories meant more climbs. This was survival math. A sweep who did not eat enough could not climb, and a sweep who could not climb was worthless. Meat itself was a luxury you almost never touched. When it appeared, it was usually offcuts so tough they could double as shoe leather. Victorian markets did not waste anything, so the poor often got what the wealthy would not touch: heads, feet, intestines. Even those were boiled until barely edible. Rats were also on the menu when desperation ran high. Contemporary reports noted that the poorest Londoners would catch and roast street rats, not because it was appetizing, but because it was free protein. Imagine dragging yourself out of a chimney, lungs coated in soot, only to sit down to gnaw on a rat leg with your soot-covered fingers. Milk was no salvation either. By the mid-1800s, most of the milk sold in London had been watered down, skimmed, or contaminated. One infamous scandal revealed that dairymen added chalk, flour, and even plaster to milk to make it appear whiter. It looked fresh, but it was slowly poisoning entire neighbourhoods. In fact, contaminated milk was one of the leading causes of infant mortality in Victorian England. For a chimney sweep, it simply meant another source of disease disguised as nourishment. Sweet foods were rare, but sugar itself was not. The empire pumped sugar into Britain by the ton, harvested by enslaved and indentured labour in the Caribbean. What reached you, however, was not fine pastries but molasses and treacle, cheap byproducts sold in bulk. Sweeps sometimes sucked on treacle to mask the taste of soot in their throats. It stuck to your teeth, coated your tongue, and turned into a grim kind of comfort food. That comfort came with cavities and gum disease, not that Victorian dentistry offered much beyond pliers and brandy. Victorian society liked to pretend children could survive on crumbs and good cheer. In reality, malnourished chimney sweeps were stunted, their bones weak, their growth permanently affected. Skeletal remains of 19th-century child labourers show bowed legs from rickets, the result of vitamin D deficiency. Working all day inside dark chimneys meant you rarely saw sunlight, which only worsened the condition. So even when you did eat, your body was starving in ways food could not fix. And then there was alcohol. Yes, children drank. Ale was considered safer than water, so sweeps were sometimes given weak beer to drink during the day. It was low in alcohol but high in calories compared to filthy water. Gin, however, was another matter. Cheap gin flowed through London like water itself, and some masters gave it to sweeps to dull their coughing fits and quiet their complaints. It did not help their health, but it made them easier to manage. You wipe your mouth with the back of your blackened hand, taste still lingering somewhere between ash and rancid fat. This was not food in any modern sense of the word. It was fuel, barely enough to scrape by, and more often than not it carried its own poisons. Every meal was a gamble between hunger and disease, and most sweeps lived constantly in the grey space between the two. The smells of Victorian London only made it worse. Imagine trying to eat bread soaked in foul water while standing in a street lined with horse manure, rotting vegetables, and human waste tossed from chamber pots. Your appetite never had a chance. In fact, many accounts describe sweeps as gaunt, skeletal children who looked half-starved even when they were not actively starving. Society did not see them as underfed, it saw them as properly sized for chimneys. And as you sit with your crust of bread surrounded by the grime and smoke of the city, you realise your diet is just another form of control. You're kept small, weak and dependent, never strong enough to resist or run, but just alive enough to keep climbing. The soot in your lungs and the hunger in your belly blend into one constant ache. And as another day begins, you understand that the chimneys were only half the misery. Because once you leave the table, another horror waits in the streets themselves, where danger was not hidden inside chimneys but lying in the open, ready to swallow you whole. The crust of bread and foul water barely sit in your stomach before it is time to climb again, and this is where the true cost of the work begins to show itself. The body of a Victorian chimney sweep was not a child's body in any normal sense. It was a body moulded by soot, brick, and misery. Years of crawling up chimneys carved it into a shape more tool than human. Your bones bend inward from years of squeezing into shafts. Knees and spines twisted into angles that would make a modern orthopedic surgeon faint. Sweeps were often described as permanently hunched, with shoulders caved and joints that ground together like rusted hinges. The job literally stunted growth. Malnourishment combined with physical stress meant most sweeps remained small, frail adults, their height arrested by starvation and soot. A Victorian observer once remarked that chimney sweeps looked like men compressed into boys, a grotesque reminder that labour could freeze you in childhood forever. And then there was the skin. Every climb left cuts and scrapes, and every cut filled with soot. Over time, the skin of sweeps turned grey and hard, almost like leather. Many were covered in open sores that never fully healed, because they were constantly reopened by brick and ash. Infection was common, yet rarely treated. A child who could not climb because of wounds was quickly replaced, so the incentive was always to keep going, no matter how deep the cut or how black the bruise. It was not just the outside of the body that paid the price. The lungs of chimney sweeps were destroyed before adulthood. Every climb meant inhaling carbon particles that settled deep in the chest. Chronic bronchitis, wheezing coughs, and shortness of breath were practically universal among sweeps. Some accounts described sweeps coughing up black mucus daily, a kind of grim internal housekeeping. Tuberculosis also thrived in the cramped, filthy conditions where sweeps lived and slept. To Victorian society it was background noise. To the children themselves it was a slow suffocation. The strangest and perhaps most shocking deformity was the cancer that became known as soot-wort. First identified in the late 18th century by surgeon Percival Pott, it was the earliest recognised occupational cancer. Sweeps developed malignant tumours on their scrotums, caused by constant contact with soot particles. Imagine a disease so specific to your job that it could only happen to people who crawled up chimneys. Children too young to spell their names were already doomed to a cancer that society did not understand and rarely treated. By adulthood, if you reached it, the only cure was brutal surgery without anaesthesia. Many simply died. And then there were the accidents. Chimneys could collapse, or sweeps could get stuck and suffocate. Fires sometimes reignited while a child was inside. Inquests occasionally turned up tiny bodies still wedged in flues, a tragic testament to how common death on the job was. Even those who survived had scars that told their own stories, burn marks across arms and legs, missing fingers, and cracked teeth from chewing through grit. The work was not just a job, it was a slow transformation into something unrecognisable. The deformities extended to posture and gait. Many sweeps walked with permanent limps or stoops, their backs bent from years of crawling on hands and knees. Climbing also forced children to wedge their chins against brick for leverage, which left them with thickened skin and crooked necks. They were living fossils of their trade, carrying every chimney on their bodies long after the workday ended. Victorian society had a cruel way of normalising these disfigurements. Illustrations of sweeps often portrayed them as ragged but cheerful, little blackened figures with brushes in hand. In reality, they were disfigured, scarred, and prematurely aged. By the time a sweep reached his 20s, if he lived that long, he often looked decades older. Wrinkled faces, hollow eyes, and twisted spines told a story that polite society preferred not to look at directly. And yet, bizarrely, sweeps were woven into public rituals of luck. People believed that touching a sweep's sooty body brought good fortune, as if centuries of deformity and disease were just a charm to be rubbed off onto the wealthy. To shake hands with a chimney sweep at a wedding was considered lucky, a tradition that still lingers faintly today. It was as though society saw the damage but chose to reframe it as magic rather than misery. You stretch your legs after another climb, but they do not stretch properly. They ache, twist, and resist, like old wood swollen with damp. Your lungs wheeze, your skin itches with soot, and your back cannot straighten. This is not temporary. This is your body now. It will never be whole again. The food kept you alive, but the work reshaped you. You were sculpted by soot into something useful, profitable, but not human. And as the day drags on, the streets outside call you back. Because once you step out of the chimney, you're still not safe. The very city you live in, with its smog and filth and endless hazards, is its own kind of death trap. The soot never really leaves your body, but the moment you step out of the chimney you're greeted by a new kind of filth. The streets of Victorian London were their own choking maze, and for a chimney sweep they were both workplace and trap. The city was alive with smoke, sewage and horse manure, a blend so constant it almost felt like weather. People wrote about London fog as if it were romantic, but for you it was not fog at all. It was coal smoke mixed with industrial fumes and human waste, thick enough to sting your eyes and coat your lungs even when you were not climbing. By the mid-1800s, London produced thousands of tons of horse manure every day. Horses powered transport, and every horse left behind an impressive calling card. Sweeps walking barefoot or in tattered shoes had no choice but to step through it. And when rain came, the manure turned the streets into black rivers that mixed with chamber pot waste thrown from windows. Yes, the same chamber pots your employers emptied by simply shouting a warning before dumping the contents into the street. This was the water you played in as a child, the mud you splashed through, the very path you took to work. No one in history has ever been more in need of a shower than a Victorian street child, and yet showers did not exist. The danger was not only in what you stepped on, but what you breathed. Factories pumped smoke into the air without restraint. The Industrial Revolution had transformed London into a city of chimneys, and while you climbed some of them, many more belched coal ash over the rooftops. By 1848, official reports estimated that the average Londoner inhaled the equivalent of several tablespoons of soot a week simply by breathing. Sweeps inhaled that amount before breakfast. Disease thrived in these conditions. Cholera outbreaks swept through neighbourhoods with terrifying speed, fueled by contaminated water. Typhus, smallpox and tuberculosis were constant companions. Children like you lived in cramped lodging houses, often 20 or more to a single room. Air barely circulated, lice and fleas spread unchecked, and one sick child could infect an entire household in days. Mortality rates for poor children were staggering. In some districts, half of all children died before their 5th birthday. Surviving to work as a sweep was not proof of luck, it was just a postponement. The streets also carried more direct dangers. Carts and wagons crushed unwary pedestrians. Without traffic laws, horses collided, wheels splintered, and accidents were frequent. Sweeps, often small and underfed, darted through traffic in search of work, making them especially vulnerable. Some accounts even mention sweeps being run over while carrying their brushes, their bodies mangled under iron wheels. It was not the kind of heroic industrial accident that newspapers cared to print, just another nameless child in a city overflowing with them. Yet the irony was that while the streets reeked of filth, sweeps themselves were seen as dirtier still. Covered in soot from head to toe, with hair matted and skin grey, you were often barred from entering certain shops. Respectable citizens pinched their noses or crossed the street when they saw you coming. This was not simply prejudice, it was also superstition. Victorians feared that dirt carried disease, which was not entirely wrong, but they also believed moral corruption was visible on the body. To them, your blackened skin was proof you were tainted inside as well as out. In spite of this disgust, society still depended on you. Without sweeps, fires would consume homes. Insurance companies demanded regular chimney cleaning to avoid costly payouts, which meant sweeps were technically a public safety measure. You were despised yet necessary, ignored yet everywhere. The contradiction defined Victorian London itself, a city that prided itself on progress while burying its poorest in filth. The soundscape of the streets added another layer of misery. Hawkers shouted, horses clattered, bells rang from factories, and church towers tolled endlessly. But the most chilling sounds were often closer to the ground. The cries of hungry children, the hacking coughs of the ill, and the splash of buckets being emptied into gutters created a chorus that never ended. At night, the noises shifted to drunks stumbling home, fights breaking out, and police dragging people away. Sleep was never peaceful, only interrupted by different shades of a noise. The smells were just as relentless. The stench of rotting vegetables from markets mingled with urine from alleys and smoke from tallow candles. Every corner of the city carried its own particular perfume of decay. For chimney sweeps, whose noses were already clogged with soot, these smells were dulled but not erased. It was like living in a stew of filth, where every breath reminded you of the weight of the city pressing down. Children were everywhere, not just sweeps, but flower girls, match sellers, shoe shiners, and pickpockets. London was a city of child labour, and sweeps were only one of its most extreme examples. Historians estimate that 1/3 of working-class children in mid-Victorian London held jobs. Factories, mines, and streets all demanded their share of small bodies. Sweeps were remarkable only in how dangerous the job was, not in the fact that they worked. Childhood as a concept barely existed. You were not seen as a person with a future, you were seen as a commodity. And so, when you emerged from a chimney, blackened and wheezing, you stepped into streets that offered no escape. There was no clean air, no fresh water, no safe space to recover. The city itself was another chimney, larger, wider, but just as suffocating. The soot inside the flue clung to your lungs, and the soot in the streets clung to your skin. It was a loop you could not break, an environment that ensured you never felt clean or whole. You rub your eyes, streaking them darker with soot as you prepare to walk to the next job. Around you the city churns, carts rattle past, and the air vibrates with the hum of 1,000,000 fires burning coal. Somewhere in the distance the river carries waste out toward the sea, but not fast enough to wash the city clean. London itself feels like one vast machine, and you're just a cog inside, grinding down day by day. And even when the city slept, you did not escape its grip. Night carried new hazards, new smells, new fears. The soot was not the only shadow following you, because in the darkness of the Victorian streets, another danger waited, one not born of chimneys or disease but of people themselves, ready to exploit every weakness you had left. The soot clings to your lungs, the streets choke you with filth, but there is something even harder to escape. The people who control your life. Chimney sweeps were not just trapped inside chimneys, they were trapped inside a system built on exploitation. Masters treated children less like apprentices and more like livestock, feeding them just enough to keep them working and disciplining them with whatever tool was closest at hand. Victorian newspapers occasionally reported on abuses, but more often the cruelty was so normal it barely registered. Beatings were routine, not an exception. Refuse to climb a chimney because the smoke was still rising. Expect a kick, a cane, or worse, a shove straight into the flue. The small size that made you valuable also made you defenseless. A sweep could be whipped, starved, or locked in a cellar for refusing work, and no one outside the trade cared enough to intervene. Some masters were notorious for using fire as motivation. Lighting a bundle of straw at the bottom of the chimney was known as climbing the hot flue. The heat and smoke forced the child upward, choking and scrambling with burns as the inevitable price of speed. It was a punishment disguised as encouragement, a grotesque way of reminding you that soot was not the only danger waiting in a chimney. Records from the early 1800s describe children emerging blistered and gasping, their bodies marked permanently by flames meant to drive them faster. The law did not protect you. Britain passed the first Chimney Sweepers Act in 1788, which technically required sweeps to be at least 8 years old. In practice, it was ignored. Some sweeps were as young as 5, their tiny bodies stuffed into flues so narrow adults could not even see the top. Later laws tried to regulate the trade further, but without enforcement they were little more than paper promises. Masters forged ages, bribed inspectors, or simply ignored the rules altogether. The system was designed to look moral from a distance while functioning exactly as before. Public attitudes added another layer of cruelty. To wealthier households, you were a nuisance, tolerated only because you kept fires safe. Children who crawled through their chimneys emerged covered in soot, stinking of sweat and ash, and were often scolded for dirtying the carpets. Imagine cleaning someone else's home only to be insulted for being filthy. Respectable Victorians loved their warm parlours, but hated the reminder of how that warmth was maintained. Exploitation went beyond beatings and insults. Many masters treated their climbing boys as property, hiring them out for dangerous jobs and pocketing the money. Some sold them to other sweepers entirely, reducing a human life to a commodity that could be transferred for profit. In some cases, children were kidnapped or tricked into the trade. Orphans were particularly vulnerable. Charitable institutions sometimes sent unwanted children to sweeps, believing that work was better than idleness, a sentiment that ignored the high mortality rates. And the work did not end with daylight. Sweeps often doubled as general servants, forced to haul soot, clean yards, or fetch water when chimneys were quiet. Masters controlled where they slept, what they ate, and how much they worked, which meant every waking hour was subject to someone else's demands. Freedom was not a concept you understood. Your choices were climb, obey, or suffer worse. The psychological toll was as heavy as the physical one. Constant punishment bred fear, and fear kept sweeps obedient. Children who cried were mocked for weakness, while those who resisted were beaten harder. Over time, the work stripped away not only health, but spirit. Accounts describe sweeps who stopped speaking altogether, reduced to quiet, soot-blackened figures who obeyed commands automatically. It was survival, but survival that eroded humanity itself. Yet, in a strange twist, sweeps still found themselves tangled in superstition. While masters abused them and society scorned them, the same people believed chimney sweeps brought good fortune. A sweep at your wedding was a lucky charm, and touching a sweep's soot-covered clothes was said to ward off evil. Imagine being beaten one day and hired as a living good luck charm the next. Your misery transformed into someone else's superstition. It was exploitation dressed up as folklore, and it did nothing to make life easier for the children living it. The violence was not confined to masters alone. Other children, slightly older and higher in rank, often bullied the smallest sweeps. Climbing was a hierarchy, and those who managed to survive longer could exert power over the newest recruits. Hazing included everything from forcing younger boys to eat soot to locking them inside flues as tests of courage. These rituals were not just cruel, they were deadly. Every moment of misery trickled downward, ensuring that even among sweeps there was no real refuge. The exploitation shaped your body, your health, and even your identity. You were not a child in any meaningful sense. You were a tool of fire prevention, an expendable safeguard for the comfort of others. And while the scars on your back faded into shadow, the damage to your lungs, bones, and spirit lasted for life. As the day ends, the chimney shafts are finally quiet, but that does not mean safety. Masters still control where you sleep, and the city around you still teems with hazards that care nothing for your suffering. The night brings no peace. Only another round of coughing fits, hunger pains, and the looming certainty that tomorrow will be the same. And just when you think you have catalogued every misery, there is another layer. The chimneys themselves were not just dirty, they were death traps designed without thought for human bodies. Fires, collapses, suffocations, and the eerie silence of children who never emerged again haunted every climb. Inside the chimney there is no room to move and no guarantee you will come back out. The flues twist at odd angles, some horizontal, some vertical, some narrowing so tightly you can feel your ribs compress. Victorian chimneys were not designed for people, they were designed for heat. Multiple fireplaces often connected to the same flue, a labyrinth of passages crammed into walls to feed the grand hearths of townhouses and mansions. For a child forced to climb them, it was less like work and more like crawling through a trap designed to punish curiosity. One of the most terrifying risks was suffocation. Chimneys were lined with soot that easily collapsed inward. One wrong movement, one brush stroke too hard, and the flakes above you rained down in a black avalanche. Within seconds, the air filled with powder, clogging your throat and coating your eyes until you were blind. There were recorded cases of sweeps being smothered in minutes, their bodies later found wedged in bends of the flue, limbs locked in place. Inquests described them as if they had turned to stone, frozen by the final grip of soot. The heat was no less dangerous. Families did not always wait for fires to be fully extinguished before sending a sweep up. Residual warmth could still burn, and embers trapped in crevices sometimes flared when disturbed. Children emerged with scorched skin, their legs blistered, their hair singed. Masters sometimes used this deliberately, lighting straw at the base to force a child upward when he was too slow. It was a method so cruel it earned its own phrase among sweeps, but it continued well into the 19th century. To refuse meant a beating, to obey meant burns. The chimney was a corridor of pain either way. Collapses were another lurking hazard. Old chimneys often cracked or crumbled, especially in poor districts where houses were not maintained. Entire sections of brick could give way, crushing anyone inside. Even when the walls held, the confined space meant that if you slipped, you could wedge yourself so tightly you could not move at all. Sweeps carried little more than brushes and scrapers, no ropes, no safety gear, no way to signal for help. If you became stuck, the only options were rescue or death, and rescue was far from guaranteed. The public occasionally read about these tragedies when bodies were discovered days later. Newspapers told grim tales of children found lifeless, curled in positions that showed their desperate attempts to escape. The reports rarely criticised the masters who sent them in. Instead, they spoke of accidents, as if the children had chosen the flue like a playground gone wrong. Society knew the risks and still sent more children upward, valuing clean chimneys over safe lives. The physical strain of climbing also created accidents even when nothing collapsed. A sweep used knees, elbows and backs to wedge upward, but exhaustion made mistakes inevitable. Lose your grip and you might tumble downward, slamming against brick until you landed in the fireplace. Households occasionally came face to face with an injured sweep crashing into their parlour, a reminder that behind every roaring fire was a child hidden in the walls. Even when you survived the climb, the chimneys themselves carried a long-term threat. Coal soot is highly carcinogenic, and constant skin contact with it led to sores that never healed. Percival Pott's identification of chimney sweep carcinoma in 1775 should have been a turning point. Instead, it became a grim footnote in medical history, while thousands of children continued to crawl into cancerous shaft for decades. By the time tumours appeared, often in adolescence, the damage was irreversible. The chimney was not just a workplace, it was a slow killer that left its mark inside and out. The absurdity was how ordinary this all seemed to Victorians. Fires were a constant fear in crowded wooden houses, and clean chimneys were considered essential. The risk of losing a child was weighed against the risk of losing a home, and the home almost always won. Chimneys needed to be scrubbed, so children kept climbing. Masters argued that boys were agile and small enough to reach places brushers could not, an explanation that excused decades of preventable deaths. The sound of scraping inside the walls became part of daily life, a background noise to morning routines. Families heard the coughs, the muffled cries, and the rattle of soot falling, but few saw the children themselves. Sweeps were ghosts of the hearth, invisible labourers who risked suffocation and burns so households could gather around clean fires. The fact that their work killed them rarely disturbed anyone for long. Imagine the silence inside a chimney after a collapse, the air still filled with floating soot, the body hidden from view. Masters sometimes lit fires below in desperation, hoping the smoke would force a trapped child to move. It rarely worked. More often the fire sealed their fate, yet the practice was reported again and again, as if repeating failure might someday succeed. The chimney became not only a workplace but a grave, swallowing lives with the indifference of stone. And still you climbed, because there was no alternative. The accidents were so frequent they became expected, and each new sweep learned quickly that survival was not guaranteed. Every flue was a coin toss between emerging filthy and emerging dead. It was a gamble society forced children to take daily, and it continued until brushes and mechanical sweepers slowly replaced human bodies. You cough in the darkness, soot grinding in your teeth, and feel the walls pressing tighter. Every breath is a reminder that you are one slip away from being sealed inside forever. The fire may be out, but the heat still lingers, and the silence of the chimney is heavy with the memory of those who never crawled out. And when you do finally emerge into daylight again, blackened and wheezing, it is only to find that the misery does not stay in the flue. The filth you carried out of the chimney followed you into the rest of the home. Victorian houses were riddled with soot and smoke, a silent pollutant that spread beyond the fireplaces and into the lungs of every resident. In a way, the chimney was not just killing you, it was poisoning everyone around you too. You drag yourself out of the flue, coughing black dust that refuses to leave your throat. The job's finished for the moment, but the house around you is far from safe. The soot you scraped loose does not vanish, it settles. It seeps into carpets, curtains, lungs, and food. A clean chimney was meant to protect families from fires, but it also turned their homes into miniature factories of air pollution. The irony is that while you sacrificed your body in the shaft, the soot made sure everyone else in the household was quietly poisoned too. Victorian London was already drowning in smoke, coal-powered homes, factories and transport filling the sky with thick haze. Inside homes, fireplaces were the heart of daily life. Families gathered around them for warmth, meals were cooked on them, and social visits took place in front of the hearth. Yet every roaring fire also spewed tiny carbon particles into the room. By the early 19th century, medical writers were noting that respiratory illness was far more common in urban households than in rural areas. Coal smoke was the invisible guest at every dinner. The health effects stretched far beyond coughing. Children raised in soot-filled homes developed chronic bronchitis at staggering rates. Doctors recorded blackened lungs in patients who had never once climbed a flue. Even middle-class families who believed themselves safe inhaled smoke that slowly scarred their breathing passages. To them, coughing was simply part of life in the city. The phrase "London fog" became romantic shorthand, when in reality it was a mixture of soot and sulfur dioxide that irritated eyes, throats and chests alike. Sweeps themselves carried disease between homes, covered in soot, never properly washed, and coughing constantly. They were walking vectors of filth. Imagine sending a child into your chimney who had just slept on a bag of soot in a lodging house crammed with coughing boys. He emerges, shakes himself off, and spreads the same black dust into your parlour. Victorians fretted about dirt but continued to welcome sweeps into their homes, never connecting the dots that the very person cleaning their chimney might also be spreading tuberculosis spores across their furniture. Even food was not safe. Kitchens were often attached to hearths, and soot drifted easily onto bread, meat, and milk left nearby. Some accounts note that food took on a faintly bitter taste after a day of heavy fire use. Families grew accustomed to the flavour of coal in their meals. In poor households, where sweeping was infrequent, layers of soot fell into pots as meals cooked, turning stew black and gritty. It was an unadvertised seasoning swallowed without complaint because no one had an alternative. The damage went deeper still. Coal smoke released not just soot but sulphur and heavy metals. Lead and arsenic particles clung to walls and skin, absorbed slowly over years. Historians now believe chronic exposure contributed to the staggering rates of infant mortality in Victorian London. Entire generations breathed toxins before anyone understood what they were. Sweeps did not just clean chimneys, they maintained a system of household poisoning that touched every class, and yet society clung to its hearths as symbols of comfort. The fireplace was where family portraits were taken, where gatherings were staged, where Christmas stories were read aloud. To acknowledge that the same fires fueling nostalgia were also fueling disease would have been unthinkable. Instead, the coughs of children were dismissed as seasonal, the black stains on curtains ignored, the deaths attributed to fate. Fire was life, and soot was its shadow. You shift in the parlour, leaving a smear of black on the wallpaper without realising it. The family may scold you later, but their own lungs are already streaked with the same dust. The entire household breathes together in this cloud, sharing invisible particles that sink into the body like ghosts. Clean chimneys did prevent fires, but they never prevented illness. The home was not a sanctuary, it was just another chimney on a larger scale. When epidemics struck, soot only made matters worse. Cholera may have travelled by water, but respiratory diseases thrived in smoke-filled air. Tuberculosis spread in damp, smoky rooms where windows were kept shut against the cold. The combination of poor ventilation and endless coal fires made homes ideal incubators. Sweeps who already carried lung disease left traces in every house they entered, turning chimney maintenance into an unintentional relay of infection across neighbourhoods. The irony is that Victorians eventually recognised smoke as a civic problem, but they did not rush to protect sweeps. Public health reformers in the mid-1800s campaigned against smog and sewage, but the plight of climbing boys remained secondary. It was easier to focus on cleaning streets and building sewers than to admit that thousands of children were being slowly consumed by their work. Only when mechanical brushes began replacing human climbers did the practice begin to fade. Progress arrived not through morality but through technology. You cough again, a dry rasp that rattles in your chest, and the family across the room coughs with you. No one comments, because in Victorian London everyone coughed. The sound was as common as church bells or wagon wheels. It was not a symptom, it was a soundtrack. And in a world where soot was part of every breath, silence itself became the rarest luxury. The home may appear warm and inviting, but behind the glow of every fireplace was the same hidden enemy. The soot inside chimneys did not stay put. It spilled into every corner, into lungs, into meals, into bloodstreams. The sickness it caused blurred the line between worker and employer, because in the end everyone paid the same price. The only difference was that for you, the sweep, the suffering came sooner, harder, and without pause. And once the coughing has quieted for the night, another sound creeps in. The rattle of coins in your master's pocket, earned from your climbs, a reminder that while disease spread everywhere, profit always rose with the smoke. The wealth built on your misery did not stop at household comfort, it shaped the very city. Because the story of chimney sweeps was never only about dirt and disease, it was also about money. The coins jingle in your master's pocket, and that sound is the true heart of chimney sweeping. Every scrape of soot, every cough, every blistered knee was not about survival or safety, it was about money. The economy of Victorian London burned on coal, and coal required chimneys, and chimneys required cleaning. In the simplest equation imaginable, your life was traded for the uninterrupted warmth of wealthier households. Fires were constant in Victorian homes. A middle-class family might light a hearth 2 or 3 times a day, while larger estates burned coal in multiple rooms from morning until night. Each of those fireplaces connected to flues that clogged within weeks, building layers of soot thick enough to ignite spontaneously. Insurance companies in the 1700s began refusing to cover homes without regular chimney cleaning, which meant sweeping was not optional. It was a legal financial necessity. Every family with a fire needed a sweep, and that guaranteed demand. Masters quickly learned how to profit. A chimney sweep with a team of boys could service dozens of homes in a week, charging fees that looked small to the customer but added up quickly. 1 shilling here, 2 shillings there, multiplied across entire neighbourhoods. The boys saw almost none of this. Payment went to the master, who deducted food, lodging and clothes from the earnings, leaving the children permanently indebted. In effect, sweeps worked for free, bound by a system that paid them just enough to survive but never enough to escape. The economics were brutal in their efficiency. Children were cheap. They required little food, no training and no wages beyond scraps. If one died in a chimney, there was always another orphan, beggar or abandoned child to take his place. Workhouses designed to reduce poverty often sent children directly into trades like sweeping. Charities intended to protect the poor became part of the supply chain, feeding labour into the very system they claimed to fight. A boy might cost a few coins to acquire, but once purchased, his body generated steady profit until it gave out. The profit was not limited to masters. Builders, landlords and homeowners all benefited from cheap child labour. Houses could be designed with narrower, more complicated flues, because there was always a small body available to clean them. Narrow flues were more efficient at carrying smoke, which meant less heat lost and less coal wasted. In other words, the very architecture of London grew crueler because sweeps existed. Your suffering was not an accident, it was baked into the bricks themselves. Even the government had a financial interest in keeping the trade alive. Coal was heavily taxed, and hearths were taxed too. The more fires burned, the more revenue flowed into the treasury. Clean chimneys meant more fires, which meant more taxes. Lawmakers debated regulations for decades, but every proposal threatened to reduce profits, and so laws remained weak or unenforced. The state profited every time you crawled into a flue, which meant there was little incentive to save you from it. The absurdity is that chimney sweeping became part of the broader economy of respectability. Wealthy families wanted clean homes not only to avoid fires, but to display refinement. A blackened fireplace suggested negligence, while a polished one suggested care and prosperity. Sweeps were hired not just for safety, but for appearances. You were part of the invisible labour that maintained the illusion of Victorian order, an unacknowledged figure keeping parlours spotless while your own body fell apart. And yet, for all the profit flowing upward, sweeps themselves remained some of the poorest in the city. The average sweep's apprentice lived on crusts of bread and slept in soot sacks, while his master collected coins from homes with chandeliers and silk curtains. The imbalance was staggering, but also invisible. The suffering at the bottom was masked by the comfort at the top. Families who paid for your work rarely saw your lodging, your sores, or your lungs. They saw only a clean chimney and handed over a coin with the satisfaction of a job well managed. There were attempts at reform, but even these were shaped by money. Mechanical brushes were invented in the late 18th century, capable of cleaning chimneys without human bodies. Yet many masters resisted adopting them, arguing that brushes could not reach every corner. The real reason was cost. A brush was a one-time purchase, but a child was endlessly replaceable. As long as orphans and paupers existed, the child remained the cheaper option. Progress was delayed not by ignorance, but by profit margins. The economics even shaped public rituals. Sweeps were hired for weddings not just as symbols of luck, but because masters realized they could monetize superstition. Couples paid to have a sweep attend, shake hands, or kiss the bride's cheek, transforming centuries of misery into a side hustle. The irony is sharp. The same child who nearly suffocated in your chimney that morning might stand at your wedding that afternoon. smiling on command while covered in the same soot you paid him to clean. You sit on a step, coughing, and watch your master count coins. Each shilling represents another flu conquered, another climb survived. But none of it belongs to you. Your labour fuels his livelihood, his meals, his bed, his future. Your own future is as narrow and black as the flues you climb. The economy of sweeping is designed so that only one figure profits, and it is never the child doing the work. And as night falls, you realise that your exhaustion is not an accident but a calculation. The hunger, the coughing, the sores, the endless climbs, all of it feeds into a machine of profit. The soot covers your skin, but the gold shines in someone else's hand. The economy has already decided what your body is worth, and the answer is never enough. The fire has been cleaned, the coins have been counted, but superstition still lingers in the streets. Because in the bizarre logic of Victorian society, chimney sweeps were not just workers. They were omens of fortune, symbols of luck, living charms believed to carry blessings with every smear of soot. And that strange superstition became its own form of currency, one that turned your misery into a myth families paid to believe. The soot on your skin is still damp, your lungs still wheeze, but outside the flues another strange layer of your existence takes shape. For all the disgust society hurled at sweeps, they also considered you a walking charm. Covered in filth, half-starved and limping from burns, you were somehow transformed into a symbol of luck. This was not compassion. It was superstition dressed up as admiration, a way for people to touch your misery without ever acknowledging it. The roots of this belief stretched back centuries. In the 18th century, King George II was said to have been saved by a chimney sweep who pulled him away from a runaway carriage. Another version claimed that a sweep frightened the horse into stopping. Either way, the story spread that sweeps carried divine favour. To shake the hand of a sweep was to borrow some of that fortune, as if soot itself were blessed dust. By the 19th century, the tradition was so embedded that couples paid to have sweeps attend weddings. A blackened child, barely able to breathe from the morning's climbs, might be scrubbed just enough to appear in photographs as a lucky guest. Victorian newspapers reinforced this odd transformation. Advertisements for wedding services sometimes included sweeps alongside florists and musicians. Lucky charms were part of the market, and sweeps became rentable omens. It is difficult to overstate how bizarre this was. The same child barred from shops for being filthy was suddenly paraded into the most respectable social events, because soot, when framed as luck, was no longer contamination but blessing. Even touching a sweep on the street was said to bring prosperity. People reached out for a handshake or a tap on the shoulder, hoping some of your soot might rub off. The irony was almost comical. The soot that gave you cancer and infected your cuts was treated as good fortune for anyone wealthy enough to only encounter it for a moment. For you, soot was death. For them, it was destiny. The contradiction reveals much about Victorian society. Luck was always something that could be purchased, displayed or staged. Hiring a sweep for your wedding was less about faith and more about signalling. It said you believed in tradition, that you respected folklore, and that you could afford to pay for even the strangest details. Sweeps were not guests, they were props. Living, coughing, soot-covered props, dragged from misery into ceremony for a few minutes of theatre. It went beyond weddings. In some parts of England, households believed the first person through the door on New Year's Day determined the fortune of the year. If that figure happened to be a sweep, blackened and bent, it was considered the height of luck. Imagine beginning your year with a child who had just crawled through another man's chimney, his hands cracked and lungs rattling, standing in your parlour as a good omen. It was not a blessing for him, but for you, it was supposed to guarantee prosperity. The oddest part is how sweeps themselves sometimes leaned into the superstition. Desperate for extra income, some boys sang songs or carried tokens, offering blessings in exchange for coins. They were not priests, but they played the role society cast for them. Singing, soot-covered children roamed the streets, half performers, half labourers, always caught between poverty and spectacle. It was exploitation on both sides, but for a moment the soot became a currency in its own right. Folklore was not unique to Britain. Across Europe, sweeps carried similar associations. In Germany, tiny chimney sweep figurines were sold as New Year's gifts, their black faces and brushes miniature symbols of fortune. Even today you can find cards and charms with smiling sweeps, proof of how long the idea survived. The irony is that these cheerful symbols bore no resemblance to the real children who wheezed and suffered inside the flues. The myth outlived the misery, which is often how history works. At the same time, superstition did nothing to protect sweeps from scorn. Passers-by still pinched their noses, still mocked their filth, still turned them away from shops. The same people who hired you to stand at a wedding might cross the street to avoid brushing against you on an ordinary day. It was a contradiction so sharp it bordered on parody. Luck when purchased, disgust when free. The soot itself became a metaphor for Victorian hypocrisy. Families scrubbed their chimneys with your body, then scrubbed their hands on your clothes for fortune. They hated the dirt but loved the symbol. They shunned your misery but celebrated the myth. Your suffering was both contamination and charm, depending entirely on how it was framed, and so you stood at thresholds, paraded at ceremonies, or grabbed on the street, all while carrying the scars of a trade that slowly killed you. Folklore gave you a role beyond the flu, but it was not a role that saved you. It only deepened the absurdity, turning exploitation into entertainment, misery into myth, soot into luck. The coins jingled in masters' pockets when sweeps were hired for weddings, and that money reinforced the system. Profit came not only from chimneys, but from ceremonies. Every superstition became another excuse to keep the trade alive. Reformers argued about brushes and safety laws, but the public clung to the image of the lucky sweep. As long as the myth endured, so did the trade. You cough, leaving a smear of soot on your hand, and realize that even your sickness has been transformed into someone else's charm. The black that eats your lungs is the same black they want on their hands. The shadow that shortens your life is the glow that brightens theirs. And once the wedding bells fade and the coins are pocketed, you return to the chimneys, climbing again, scraping again, suffocating again. The superstition ends at the church door, and the soot resumes its real work. But outside those doors, change was beginning to stir. Reformers were pushing harder, inventors were tinkering with new machines, and the age of climbing boys was slowly reaching its end. The question was never whether the system was cruel. It was how long society could pretend it was luck instead of labour. The wedding bells fade, the soot-like charm is gone, and you are back in the flues. But outside your cramped world, reformers were beginning to stir. By the late 18th century, even the most hard-nosed Victorians had to admit that sending children up burning chimneys might not be the hallmark of a civilised empire. Yet the road to ending the practice was as crooked as the flues themselves. Laws came, laws failed, and in between, countless children kept climbing. The first attempt came in 1788 with the Chimney Sweepers Act. On paper, it looked promising. It forbade the employment of children under 8, and required that all apprentices be registered. In reality, it was as effective as telling people not to eat pie. Masters forged documents, ignored the rules, and kept recruiting 5- and 6-year-olds because their size fit the chimneys best. Registration books went uninspected, and enforcement was practically non-existent. The law was little more than soot smudged on parchment. Over the next decades, reformers tried again and again. The Chimney Sweepers Act of 1834 raised the minimum age to 14 and required licensing. It sounded bold, but was undermined the moment it passed. Masters simply claimed their apprentices were older, and with no birth certificates to prove otherwise, who could argue? Inspectors rarely appeared, and when they did, they often looked the other way. Children continued to crawl into flues while the law nodded politely from a distance. One of the most persistent voices against the practice was Lord Shaftesbury, the same reformer who fought against child labour in factories and mines. He argued that climbing boys were subjected to cruelties unparalleled, citing cases of suffocation, burns and cancers. He pushed relentlessly for mechanical brushes to replace children, pointing out that machines had been available for decades. Yet resistance was fierce. Masters claimed brushes could not clean narrow flues. Homeowners insisted they needed the thoroughness of human climbers. In truth, both arguments were excuses to maintain a cheap labour supply. The absurdity is that even when technology clearly worked, people clung to tradition. The idea of sending children up chimneys had become so normal that it was hard to imagine another way. Some householders even complained that brushes scratched the inside of flues or left soot behind, as if a child with infected sores and blackened lungs was somehow a higher standard of workmanship. Reformers faced not only economic resistance, but cultural inertia, the kind of stubbornness that valued habit over human lives. In 1840, another law raised the minimum age to 21, an almost laughable attempt to sound strict. If it had been enforced, the climbing boy would have ceased to exist instantly, since no grown man could fit the flues. But again, enforcement was absent. Boys under 10 were still being found inside chimneys well into the 1860s. Reformers could draft laws, but without inspectors, fines, or public outrage, the paper carried no weight. It was as though Parliament had declared that gravity should no longer apply, then sat back as people continued to fall. What finally began to turn the tide was not morality, but scandal. Cases of children suffocating inside chimneys captured public attention, especially when reported with lurid detail in newspapers. Inquests described the positions of bodies, the claw marks on brick, the burns on skin. These stories horrified readers, but only in waves. Outrage rose, then faded, while the system carried on. It was tragedy packaged as sensation, more shocking headline than permanent solution. The breakthrough came with the invention and promotion of more effective mechanical sweepers. Inventors like Joseph Glass in the 1820s designed extendable, jointed rods with brushes that could navigate the narrowest flues. These devices proved not only safer but faster. With enough demonstrations and pressure, even reluctant masters began to adopt them. The machine was not sentimental, it was efficient. And in Victorian England, efficiency often succeeded where compassion failed. By the 1870s, climbing boys had largely disappeared in London, though they lingered in rural areas where resistance to change was strongest. The last major act, the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875, finally required local authorities to license all sweeps and enforce safety. At last, the law had teeth, and inspectors had power to prosecute offenders. The trade shifted to adults with brushes rather than children with bones scraped raw. But this victory came nearly a century after the first attempt at reform. For almost 100 years, Britain had knowingly allowed children to suffocate in flues, while insisting it could not be helped. The absurd length of this battle reveals how deeply child labour was woven into Victorian society. The question was never whether the practice was cruel. Everyone knew it was. The question was always whether cruelty could be justified by cost, tradition, or convenience. For nearly a century, the answer had been yes. Reform arrived only when machines outcompeted misery. And while the climbing boy faded from chimneys, he never fully left the culture. Folklore, songs and imagery kept the sweep alive as a symbol of poverty, luck, or nostalgia. Mechanical brushes cleaned the soot, but they did not erase the memory of the children who had done it first. Even today, wedding cards in parts of Europe feature smiling chimney sweeps as lucky mascots, a cheerful ghost of a trade that killed thousands. You drag your brush across the hearth one final time, the crackle of bristles against brick louder than any law. Reformers may argue in Parliament, inventors may patent rods and brushes, but for you the climb does not end. The flue is still dark, the soot still thick, and the master still waiting for his coins. Change may be coming, but it moves slower than a child wedged in brick. Until it arrives fully, the misery continues with each cough, each scrape, each climb. and while lawmakers argued and reformers preached, you still had to survive the nights. Because once the chimneys were done and the soot settled, the place you returned to was no sanctuary. The lodging houses of chimney sweeps were their own kind of nightmare, crammed with filth, hunger, and disease. The laws may have been written in ink and reformers may have argued in Parliament, but when the work ended for the day, you still had to crawl into a bed that was hardly worthy of the word. Sleeping arrangements for chimney sweeps were less about comfort and more about containment. Children were lodged like tools, stored wherever there was space, and space was usually wherever soot had already collected. Most sweeps slept on soot sacks, literally the same bags used to carry ash from the day's climbs. The logic was simple. The bags were already filthy, and so were you. Put them together and you saved on cleaning. The result was children curled on mounds of gritty powder, inhaling soot even in their sleep. A night on a soot sack was less about rest and more about extending the workday into unconsciousness. Doctors who inspected lodging houses reported that sweeps rarely woke without coughing up black mucus, their lungs as coated as the chimneys they had scraped hours before. The houses themselves were cramped, filthy, and swarming with vermin. Lodging masters often crammed dozens of children into single rooms, claiming they were being housed, while pocketing most of the money themselves. Straw mats on damp floors served as beds when soot sacks were not available. The smell was a mixture of mildew, coal dust, and the sharp tang of unwashed bodies. Fresh air was a rarity. Windows were few and often nailed shut to conserve heat, turning rooms into smoky coffins where disease spread unchecked. Illness was as much a resident as the children themselves. Tuberculosis and typhus were common companions, carried from flue to lodging and back again. Lice burrowed into hair, fleas nested in blankets, rats scurried across floors at night. Sleeping was an act of surrender, not restoration, as every scratch and every cough reminded you that you were never truly at rest. Reports from health inspectors in the mid-1800s described sweep lodging houses as dens of pestilence, words that sound poetic until you realise they meant exactly what they said. Food was rarely provided in these quarters, but hunger followed you into the night. Children often pulled scraps, gnawing stale bread or chewing on bones salvaged from kitchens where they worked. Some lodging masters sold ale to sweeps, encouraging even the youngest to drink themselves into drowsy silence. It was not relaxation but sedation, a way to keep exhausted children quiet until morning. Gin was cheaper than comfort, and gin was abundant in Victorian London. And then there was the cold. Fires were for customers, not for sweeps. Lodging houses rarely kept hearths burning for the children. Winter nights in London were damp and freezing, and sweeps huddled together under rags for warmth. Accounts mention boys so small they disappeared beneath soot sacks, only their coughing giving them away. Frostbitten fingers and toes were common, especially when masters refused to provide shoes. A child might climb chimneys barefoot, then sleep barefoot, then wake to climb again, his body slowly stiffening into deformity before it was even grown. Despite the misery, there were glimpses of humanity. Sweeps sometimes carved little games out of scraps of wood, sang songs to distract from coughing, or told stories about the jobs they had survived. The humour was dark, often focused on near-death climbs or burns, but laughter in those spaces was a rebellion of its own. Shared suffering became its own form of bonding, and children who were strangers in the street became family in the soot. The lodging system also tied sweeps to their masters. Many masters owned the very houses where children slept, which meant rent was deducted from earnings before the boys ever touched a coin. This created cycles of debt that bound them indefinitely. Even those who dreamed of running away often had nowhere to go. Workhouses fed children into sweeping, lodging houses kept them trapped inside it, and the streets outside were hardly safer. The city itself was a net, and every chimney was just another knot in its weave. Occasionally reformers tried to visit these houses, and their reports horrified middle-class readers. Stories of boys sleeping naked under soot sacks, of children so hungry they gnawed candle ends, of rooms so thick with smoke they resembled the flues themselves. But outrage never lasted. Sympathy might extend to donations or sermons, but it rarely reached enforcement. The soot stayed where it was, and the children kept sleeping in it. Even in death, the lodging houses left their mark. When sweeps died from disease, accident, or neglect, their bodies were often buried in mass graves, the cheapest option available. Masters did not spend on funerals. One less mouth to feed meant more profit. The bed was filled again by another boy from the workhouse or the street, and the cycle continued. Lodging houses were not homes. They were warehouses for lives considered disposable. You lie on your soot sack, bones pressing into brick, the cough in your chest rattling louder in the silence. Around you, other children wheeze, shuffle and shift, the chorus of lungs that never rest. The walls drip with damp, rats scratch at the corners, and the air tastes of coal even without a fire. This is not sleep, this is waiting. Waiting for the next climb, the next scrape, the next day that will look exactly like this one. And yet, as grim as the nights were, they were not even the beginning of your entrapment. Because many sweeps never chose this life at all. They were fed into it by workhouses, orphanages and charitable schemes that promised salvation while delivering soot. The system of recruitment was as filthy as the chimneys themselves, and it ensured the supply of children never ran dry. The soot sack beneath you is thin, the coughing never ends, and the question that hangs in the air is simple. How did so many children end up here in the first place? The answer lies in the Victorian pipeline of poverty. Sweeps were not born into soot. They were pushed into it by institutions that claimed to protect children, while supplying them to trades that thrived on their bodies. Workhouses were at the centre of this machinery. Established under the Poor Laws, these institutions were meant to provide shelter and labour for the destitute. In theory, they were places of refuge. In practice, they were sorting machines that funneled children into industries desperate for small hands and small bodies. A master sweep could approach a workhouse and request apprentices, promising training and lodging. To administrators, this was a convenient solution. One less mouth to feed in the workhouse, one more child employed, and the books balanced neatly. The fact that the apprenticeship often meant suffocation inside a chimney was written off as unfortunate necessity. Orphanages contributed in their own way. Charity organisations in the 19th century often prided themselves on saving children from the streets. But saving them did not always mean schooling or adoption. It could mean handing them over to tradesmen. Chimney sweeping, as miserable as it was, counted as honest work. A child without parents was deemed better off with a master, even one known for cruelty, than left to wander begging. It was philanthropy by transfer, where pity transformed into soot. Parish authorities also played their part. Under the settlement laws, parishes were financially responsible for the poor in their jurisdiction. If a child was abandoned or too expensive to maintain, the parish might arrange an apprenticeship to reduce costs. Apprenticeship sounded noble, but in the case of chimney sweeping, it meant binding contracts that kept children tied to masters until adulthood. The parish saved money, the master gained labour, and the child gained nothing but soot. Some children were not even formally placed, they were sold. Families drowning in poverty sometimes gave up their youngest for a few shillings. A 5-year-old could be handed over to a sweepmaster in exchange for bread or rent money. In some cases, children were kidnapped outright. Reports from the early 19th century describe gangs of men who lured orphans or street children with promises of food, only to sell them into trades like sweeping. The law rarely pursued these cases since missing children from poor families were not considered urgent matters. Masters exploited the system ruthlessly. A child was not a worker to them but an investment. Once purchased or contracted, the boy's body became a tool to be worn down. The cost of acquisition was low, the potential profit high. If the child died in a flu, another could be obtained. The constant supply from workhouses and streets ensured there was never a shortage. This endless pipeline of replacements gave the trade its brutal resilience. The absurdity of the system was not lost on reformers. Writers in the early 19th century pointed out the hypocrisy of charitable institutions claiming to rescue children while feeding them into one of the most dangerous jobs in Britain. Yet the image of the rescued apprentice persisted. Masters often paraded their children in front of parish officials, showing them clothed and fed for inspection days. The moment the officials left, the beatings and starvation resumed. It was a theatre of care staged to keep the supply flowing. Children themselves had no voice in the arrangement. At ages when modern children are still learning letters, Victorian sweeps were signing contracts they could not read, binding them to masters until they turned 21. That age was theoretical anyway, since many never survived to adulthood. Legally they were apprentices. In reality they were indentured labourers with no path to freedom except escape or death. Even the church lent legitimacy. Sermons often preached the virtues of hard work for the poor. Idleness was considered sinful, and chimney sweeping, grim as it was, counted as productive. Better to send a child into a flue than let him wander the streets as a beggar. The soot was rebranded as morality, suffering reframed as discipline. It was Victorian logic at its most ruthless. What this created was an entire generation of children trapped by systems that pretended to save them. Workhouses reduced their costs, parishes balanced their ledgers, masters filled their pockets, and the public enjoyed clean fires. At the very centre of this economic wheel was the body of a child squeezed into a chimney, invisible except for the soot left behind. You close your eyes on the soot sack and realise your presence here was never an accident. It was the product of policies, institutions and choices made by people who would never crawl into chimneys themselves. The flue may feel like stone closing in on your ribs, but the walls were built long before you climbed them. And as you cough through another sleepless night, you remember that even the children who survived this pipeline did not emerge unscathed. Many carried the scars of their so-called apprenticeships for life. Broken bodies, diseased lungs, and stunted growth were the souvenirs of a system that had called itself benevolent. But while institutions pushed children into soot, artists, poets and writers were busy turning sweeps into symbols. In literature and paintings, chimney sweeps were not victims but figures of pity, satire or even cheer. Society might have buried your body in soot, but it paraded your image in poems and prints for all to see. Your body may be blackened, your chest hollowed with coughs, but outside the chimney another version of you lived a very different life. On the page, on the stage, and in the print shops of London, the chimney sweep became one of the most recognisable figures of Victorian culture. The irony was thick enough to choke on. Society despised you in the streets, yet it adored you in art. It rejected your touch as filth, but consumed your image as entertainment. William Blake had already painted the sweep in words at the end of the 18th century. His poem, The Chimney Sweeper, presented the child not as a worker, but as a victim, a tiny voice crying from beneath soot and suffering. Blake's imagery of coffins of blackened angels promising freedom captured the horror in a way no law had. His poems were reprinted through the Victorian era, often used by reformers as moral ammunition. Yet reading a poem and paying a sweep were not mutually exclusive. Families could nod solemnly at Blake's words before sending another boy up the flue. Charles Dickens, the master of social observation, did not ignore sweeps either. His novels often included passing references to climbing boys, lumping them alongside street hawkers, beggars, and other forgotten figures of London's underworld. Dickens's London was filled with the kind of children you might trip over in the street, small bodies labouring invisibly to keep the city alive. He never dedicated a book to sweeps alone, but his characters carried enough soot that readers could not miss the message. Child labour was not background, it was the scenery itself. Visual culture joined in. Satirical prints from the early 19th century often used chimney sweeps as symbols of dirt and disorder. In cartoons, they were drawn as mischievous scamps, their blackened faces and brushes instantly recognisable. Sometimes they were mocked, sometimes pitied, sometimes celebrated as part of the city's fabric. A child with soot-streaked cheeks became shorthand for urban poverty. by the mid-Victorian period, toy figurines of sweeps were even sold at fairs. The same society that gagged when a real sweep walked past was happy to place a painted one on a mantelpiece. Painters and illustrators softened the image further. Romantic depictions showed sweeps as cheerful boys whistling on rooftops, brushes slung over their shoulders like trophies. Their filth was transformed into quaint charm, their misery into a kind of plucky resilience. These images appeared on greeting cards, advertisements, and prints. The chimney sweep became a sentimental icon, stripped of sores, burns, and coughing fits, remade as an emblem of innocence against the grime of the city. It was a fantasy so powerful that it outlasted the trade itself. Songs carried the myth further. Street ballads celebrated sweeps in rhymes that blurred reality and cheer. Some were bawdy, others pitiful, but all turned children into caricatures for public amusement. A sweep's cry for work was even called crying the streets, a sound as common as church bells. The sing-song tone of boys advertising their labour became part of the urban soundtrack, so familiar it became fodder for comic imitation on stage. To audiences the sound was quaint. To the children themselves it was hunger put into melody. Superstition added its own twist. The idea that sweeps brought luck was not just folklore, it became a marketable identity. Wedding cards showed smiling sweeps tipping their caps. Trinkets with tiny brushes dangled from watch chains. In Germany and Austria, miniature sweeps were sold as good luck charms at New Year's, a tradition that still survives today. The soot that killed children was recast as the soot that blessed marriages and bank accounts. Misery became merchandise. The disconnect between image and reality was vast. Real sweeps bore scars, walked with limps, and coughed their way into early graves. Their counterparts in prints and songs looked sprightly, cheeky, even lucky. The artistic sweep was a child the public could consume without guilt. He was soot without smell, poverty without pain, labour without death. A fantasy child who smiled where real children gasped. Even reformers understood the power of image. Campaigns against climbing boys often included sentimental drawings of soot-covered children praying or weeping. These images circulated in pamphlets and newspapers, tugging at heartstrings more effectively than statistics. In an age before photographs were common, illustration became propaganda. The face of a sweep could move readers in ways parliamentary debates never did. Yet the same sentimentalization risks softening the horror, turning suffering into something aesthetically tragic rather than brutally real. The sweep's image became so embedded in Victorian culture that even after reforms ended child climbing, the symbol lingered. Literature, songs, and cards carried him forward as nostalgia. By the 20th century, the sweep had been scrubbed clean into a romantic relic. Think of the cheerful dancing sweeps in musicals, twirling brushes as if soot were confetti. That version was born in the Victorian imagination, built on the bones of real children who never danced on rooftops except to collapse. You sit in your soot sack at night, knowing that somewhere in the city a printer has sold a caricature of your life for pennies. You know that couples are buying sweep figurines as lucky trinkets, while you cough blood into rags. The gap between your body and your image is wide enough to swallow the truth entirely. Art gave society a sweep it could love while ignoring the one it had created, and that distortion carried weight. The public could consume sentimental sweeps and feel they had acknowledged the problem, even as real children kept climbing. Images made the suffering palatable, which in turn prolonged the trade. The irony is bitter but sharp. Culture turned exploitation into entertainment, and entertainment blunted the very outrage that might have ended it sooner. The soot stains your skin, but in the eyes of painters and poets it is transformed into charm. Your misery becomes myth, your body becomes symbol, your voice becomes rhyme. You're not just a sweep anymore, you're an icon, trapped not only in chimneys but in the imagination of a society that prefers soot as a story rather than soot as a reality. And while the images lingered in print shops and poems, doctors were studying the bodies themselves. They recorded the cancers, the deformities, and the coughs with clinical precision, stripping away myth to expose the flesh beneath. The medical gaze was colder, sharper, and far less forgiving. The poems may have softened you into symbols, and the greeting cards may have turned you into charms, but doctors saw through soot with a sharper eye. They did not sketch chimney sweeps as lucky or plucky. They dissected them, measured them, and wrote about them in journals that carried no sentiment at all. Where society saw folklore, physicians saw pathology. The sweep was not a mascot, but a medical specimen, one of the first clear examples of how industry carved disease directly into the human body. The most famous case came from Percival Pott, an English surgeon who in 1775 described a peculiar cancer found almost exclusively in chimney sweeps. It began as small sores on the scrotum, sometimes mistaken for warts, that grew steadily into tumours. Left untreated, they ulcerated and spread, consuming tissue with agonising slowness. Pott identified it as a direct consequence of constant exposure to soot, making it the first recognised occupational cancer in history. Children crawling naked or half-clothed through chimneys had soot ground into every crease of their bodies. The result was a disease so specific to the trade, it was called chimney sweep carcinoma. The reports were not gentle. Medical journals described blackened lungs, scarred skin, twisted spines, and stunted growth. Physicians noted how sweeps were shorter than their peers, their skeletons bent from years of forcing themselves through flues too narrow for adult bones. Autopsies revealed lungs packed with carbon deposits, tissue that looked more like charred leather than living organ. One surgeon compared the interior of a sweep's chest to the inside of a used fireplace, an image both grotesque and accurate. Doctors also catalogued the chronic respiratory problems that plagued sweeps. Wheezing coughs, laboured breathing, and the constant production of black phlegm became diagnostic markers of the trade. Some children developed what was called soot asthma, a condition so severe that even walking short distances left them gasping. Others suffered from emphysema before they reached adolescence. Their lungs aged decades ahead of their time. In modern terms, they were industrial experiments conducted on children without consent, their bodies testifying to the effects of carbon exposure long before anyone invented the word carcinogen. Bones told another story. Years of climbing on hands and knees warped joints, producing deformities so common they earned their own category in medical texts. Knees hardened with calluses, spines curved into permanent arches, ankles twisted from years of scrambling up narrow shafts. Physicians described sweep apprentices as having bodies that seemed half-grown and half-broken, trapped between childhood and the wear of labour. Skeletal remains confirm these reports. Archaeologists studying 19th-century burial grounds have found children with bones marked by stress fractures, rickets, and severe malnutrition. The skin bore its own signature. Constant friction against brick left abrasions that rarely healed. Sores infected quickly, festered, and left permanent scars. In medical reports, these were called chimney knees and soot sores. Physicians wrote about them clinically, but the reality was less sterile. Imagine crawling through abrasive stone every day, your wounds reopening with each climb, your skin never clean enough to heal. Infection was common, and before antibiotics it was often fatal. Yet in the detached tone of medical journals, this misery became data, catalogued alongside measurements and diagrams. The absurdity is that these medical findings were clear and damning, yet little changed. Pott's discovery of chimney sweep carcinoma should have ended the trade overnight. Instead, it became a curiosity in medical history, noted in lectures and essays while children continued to die in the same chimneys that produced the disease. Knowledge existed, but action lagged behind by decades. Victorian society was willing to admire the science without eliminating the suffering. Public health officials eventually added their voices. Reports in the mid-19th century documented the filthy conditions of lodging houses, the prevalence of tuberculosis among sweeps, and the alarming rate of early deaths. Mortality statistics showed sweeps dying in their 20s and 30s, decades earlier than the general population. Yet statistics, like medical reports, were easier to print than to act upon. Laws remained unenforced, masters kept employing children, and soot kept grinding its way into skin and bone. Doctors also noted the psychological toll, though in colder language. They described sweeps as sullen, withdrawn, or stunted in temperament. Modern readers might call it trauma. To Victorians, it was just another symptom to be observed. A child beaten, burned, and starved was not only physically broken, but emotionally flattened. Yet in the pages of journals it was presented without outrage, a clinical curiosity rather than a call to arms. The presence of medical documentation also reveals the contradictions of the era. The same society that produced detailed reports of sweep diseases continued to celebrate them as lucky mascots at weddings. Physicians measured tumours while poets sentimentalised soot-stained faces. Reformers preached in Parliament while masters shoved children into chimneys. Knowledge, art, law and superstition all swirled together, producing a world where truth was known but rarely acted upon. You wipe soot from your arms and feel the sores beneath, raw patches that sting even when you lie still. Somewhere a doctor has already written about children exactly like you, their wounds preserved in ink. Your body is both a tool and a study, exploited in life and dissected in death. The medical reports may outlive you, but they do little to change your present. The soot still coats your lungs, the sores still fester, and tomorrow you will climb again. And while physicians wrote about disease with scientific precision, another danger of sweeping had nothing to do with tumours or bones. Fires, explosions and urban disasters lurked in every flue, turning households into tinder boxes and sweeps into unwilling fire alarms. A chimney was not only a workplace, it was a live fuse. Every flue you entered had the potential to ignite into an oven with you still inside. In the 19th century, urban households rarely cleaned chimneys regularly, and the build-up of creosote and soot turned them into tall black powder kegs. It only took a spark from the grate below, or a gust of hot air from a kitchen fire to send flames roaring upward. You could be halfway through a climb when the flue lit like a cannon, and your body became the obstruction in the path of a furnace. Accounts from London record sweeps who were roasted alive inside chimneys, trapped by walls too narrow to escape while flames consumed them from below. The official reports call them accidents, but the truth is that they were inevitabilities. Chimneys were never designed with safety in mind. They branched off into multiple channels, turned at sharp angles, and often narrowed in the upper stories. This created choke points where soot clumped in thick mats. When these mats caught fire, the blaze moved unpredictably, spreading sideways into neighbouring flues or blasting downward into kitchens. A single chimney fire could jump from house to house, along a street of terraced buildings, spreading through shared walls until entire blocks glowed red in the night. London's fire brigades were often overwhelmed not by factory infernos but by domestic chimneys turned into vertical torches. Explosions were a more spectacular hazard. Soot does not just accumulate as dust, it compacts into tar-like creosote that burns hotter than wood. If enough gas built up inside a sealed flue, it could ignite with explosive force. There are recorded cases of chimney pots launching off rooftops like mortars, bricks hurled into the street by the blast. The sweep, if unlucky enough to be inside, became collateral damage, limbs broken or skulls cracked against brick as the pressure threw them against the walls. Newspapers occasionally noted these explosions with a mix of horror and fascination, reporting debris scattered across cobbled streets and scorched bodies dragged from the wreckage. These disasters did not just threaten sweeps, they endangered entire families and neighbourhoods. Victorian households relied heavily on open hearths for heat and cooking, which meant chimneys ran constantly. By the mid-19th century, London alone had over 1 million domestic flues, each a potential fire trap. Insurance companies kept detailed statistics on chimney fires, and in some years they accounted for nearly a third of all urban blazes. Fire brigades lobbied for stricter chimney cleaning regulations, but masters continued to send children up rather than pay for safer mechanical brushes. It was cheaper to risk both fire and child than to invest in prevention. The absurdity is that sweeps, the very workers meant to prevent fires, often became the cause of them. A poorly trained apprentice could dislodge a burning ember or push soot into a corner where it smouldered unseen. Hours later, the flue would flare into flames, and the household would blame the sweep who had supposedly cleaned it. Thus, the profession carried not only mortal risk but public suspicion. You could spend the day scraping soot from brick, only to be accused that night of setting a blaze that gutted a family's home. Victorian reformers recognised the irony and used it to argue for change. Parliamentary debates in the early 1800s frequently referenced chimney fires as proof that relying on child sweeps was both cruel and ineffective. Inventors demonstrated mechanical brushes that could reach every corner of a flue more thoroughly than a boy. Yet householders resisted, insisting brushes scratched their brickwork or left corners untouched. In reality, many simply preferred the old system because it was cheaper and had the perverse comfort of tradition. People trusted a half-starved child over a bristle brush, even if it meant watching their roof go up in flames. The scale of urban chimney fires created secondary industries. Fire insurance companies expanded rapidly in the 18th and 19th centuries, offering policies that became almost mandatory in dense cities. Some even employed their own brigades, private firemen who wore bright uniforms and raced through streets to save insured buildings. If your house bore the plaque of a company, the brigade would do their best to save it. If it did not, they might pass it by, letting the blaze consume your livelihood. Chimney sweeps, therefore, fed indirectly into the insurance economy, a dangerous trade helping sustain the financial empires of companies like Sunfire Office and Phoenix Assurance. Meanwhile, fire brigades themselves became objects of fascination. Crowds gathered to watch blazes, cheering as water was pumped onto roofs and ladders clattered against walls. Children scrambled for dropped helmets or broken hoses as souvenirs. In this theatre of destruction, the sweep was both actor and victim, sometimes dragged from the wreckage blackened and coughing, other times reduced to a corpse carried out beneath a scorched blanket. Newspapers relished these spectacles, describing flames reflected in the Thames or sparks falling like rain across St. Paul's. For the public, it was entertainment. For the sweep, it was another day's wage gambled against incineration. You can almost feel the irony as you brush soot loose inside a flue. Every scrape increases the chance that sparks will catch. Every breath fills your lungs with the dust that fuels the fire. You're both the extinguisher and the fuel, the preventative and the hazard. Families depend on you to keep their homes safe while simultaneously blaming you when disaster strikes. The chimney is a machine, and you're its smallest, most disposable part. The history of chimney fires also reveals the limits of Victorian progress. The Industrial Revolution filled cities with steam engines, telegraphs and railways, yet domestic hearths remained stubbornly medieval. Fireplaces consumed coal by the ton, pumping soot into the air and filling chimneys with lethal deposits. Cities built train stations of iron and glass while their homes continued to burn from the same hazards that had plagued them for centuries. The sweep was caught in this contradiction, a medieval figure trapped in an industrial age, bridging past and present through soot and fire. And even as reformers pushed for safer technology, another layer of misery awaited sweeps once the flames were doused. The ashes of disaster did not vanish with the fire brigade's hoses. They settled into rubble, corpses and ruined homes, places where sweeps often returned the very next day to clean what was left of the flues. Fire was not an end to work, but an invitation to repeat it, to crawl once more into blackened bricks scarred by heat. From inside the flue, you hear the crackle of embers below, and wonder if today is the day the chimney decides to erupt. Some sweeps lived long enough to fear cancer, but many never made it past the fire. The soot you scrape is both your income and your executioner, and Victorian society treated that paradox as just another fact of life. And that's where we'll leave you, coughing up soot and questioning your life choices. If you enjoyed this delightful tour through misery, let me know in the comments which historical disaster you want to suffer through next. And of course, check out my other videos if you enjoy listening to the sound of human suffering turned into bedtime stories.